Hi everyone, my name is Andrew Smith and I'm the Urban Agriculture Educator with Purdue Extension in Vanderburgh County, Indiana. Today we're going to talk about soil sampling. Many think that soil sampling is expensive and hard to do, but in reality, it's pretty affordable, doesn't really take that much time, and gives you a wealth of information. So I'm going to take you through the steps on how to collect your soil sample, how to get it ready to send to the lab, and how to submit it to the lab. But before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about soil health and why soil sampling is important. There's three main components to soil health: biological, physical, and chemical. There's simply no better way to assess the chemistry of your soil than to send a sample to a laboratory for analysis. A soil test will give you important information like nutrient levels and pH, and there is no better way to accurately get that information than sending a sample to a laboratory for analysis. Next, soil sample results can help you select the right soil amendments for your soil. Otherwise, you're just blindly adding fertilizer, which is a waste of money and problematic for the environment. An example of this is using lime or sulfur to adjust your soil pH. I hear people say all the time that they add lime to their soil every year and don't base that decision on a soil test, but just a guess. Sometimes plant disease is caused by too little or too much of a given nutrient. Your soil may be lacking the nutrient your plant needs, or if you're blindly applying fertilizer, you may be over-fertilizing and hurting your plants. A soil analysis can help you diagnose nutrient deficiencies to ensure plant health. Now let's talk about how to collect your samples. Before we dive into the details of how to actually collect your soil sample, let's talk a little bit about coming up with a soil sampling plan. This is a very important step. If you don't take the time to determine how many soil samples you need and do it properly, you may be spending money on unnecessary samples or not actually getting the information that you hope to get from these soil samples. In most cases, one soil sample per garden area or per lawn would be sufficient. There are exceptions. If you're growing a plant that requires specific growing conditions, like blueberries for instance, you might want to sample that area separately so you can get specific information for that area. Or if you have an area where it looks like things aren't growing very well or plant health is poor, that may be another reason to sample that area separately. So let's run through a few different scenarios that will hopefully help you come up with a soil sampling plan for your lawn or garden. In this scenario, you are looking to expand your garden area and want to sample the new area. The new garden area measures approximately 30 feet by 90 feet. Unless there's anything that looks out of the ordinary, such as dead patches or discolored vegetation or soil, I would collect 6 subsamples. Mix those subsamples together in a bucket and pull the sample you plan to send to the lab from the bucket, meaning I would only submit one sample to the lab for analysis. This method of sampling is called composite sampling and is recommended in order to get a representative sample of the entire area you are sampling. If you go out and collect just one sample, you are not getting data that is representative of the entire area. Subsamples are indicated by yellow X's in the image. Purdue recommends collecting a minimum of 5 subsamples for every one sample you send to the lab. Let's look at another scenario. In this example, you want to start a school garden in the area just south of the playground. How many samples would you collect and send to the lab for this area? I would recommend sending 2 samples to the lab. You might notice that the eastern third of the proposed garden area is discolored and appears vegetation isn't growing well there, so I would recommend sampling that area separately. So in this case, you would be collecting 2 composite samples to send to the lab, each consisting of a mixture of 5 subsamples. Let's look at one last example. This homeowner wants to sample her lawn before she makes a decision about what fertilizer to use. Her lot is approximately 0.35 acres. In this case, I would recommend submitting one sample to the lab, which is the conglomerate of 6 subsamples. Now that you've got your soil sampling plan in order, let's look at how to collect the actual samples. You need 2 basic pieces of equipment, a bucket for mixing the subsamples and something to collect your samples from the ground. If you have access to a soil probe, that's your best option. Otherwise, a shovel works fine. Once you have your tools and have identified your sampling locations, you then need to determine the proper depth at which your sample should be collected. For lawns, you want to collect your sample from the top 3 or 4 inches below the thatch layer. Gardens, you want to go a little deeper, and I always try to sample from the 4 to 6 inch layer. For shrubs, Sampling from 6 to 8 inches down is appropriate, and trees should be sampled from 8 to 12 inches below the surface. Collecting your sample with the soil probe is pretty straightforward. You insert the probe to the desired depth, remove the probe, remove the desired soil from the probe, and place the soil in your bucket. Regardless of the depth, always be sure to remove plant residue before you place the subsample in the bucket. The process for collecting a sample with a shovel is similar but requires a little more effort. First, you have to dig a small hole to the desired sampling depth. Then you use your shovel to cut a slice from the side of the hole. Remove the slice and pull your soil sample from the appropriate depth. As before, remove plant residue from the surface and place your sample in the bucket. Once you've collected your minimum of 5 subsamples, mix the soil together in your bucket. For a standard soil sample, you'll need to send the lab approximately 2 cups of soil, but you should always double check with the lab if you're not sure how much soil to send. If you have dedicated soil sampling bags from the lab, use that. Otherwise, you can put your sample in a sealable plastic bag. Be sure to label your soil bag and keep records so you know exactly where the soil sample was collected from. Now that you've collected your soil and it's ready to send off, let's talk about how to get your sample to the lab. In most communities, you have a few options to choose from. In many counties, such as Vanderburgh County, for a nominal fee, you can drop off your soil samples at your local Extension service office, and they will help you prepare the sample and paperwork and ship the sample for you. Another option is dropping off your sample at the local co-op, who will then ship your sample for you and notify you when the results are ready. The last option is shipping the sample to the lab directly, which is generally the fastest option. If you ship the sample directly to the lab, you are responsible for obtaining and completing the sample submittal form and packing and shipping the samples. The results will then be sent directly to you. Regardless of the option you choose, your local extension educator will be happy to guide you through the process and help interpret the results and select the proper soil amendments for your lawn or garden. So that concludes the summary of how to collect and submit your soil sample for analysis. As usual, if you have any questions, you can contact your local Purdue Extension office. They'd be more than happy to help you with any step of this process. I posted a link at the bottom of this video. There you should be able to find contact information for your local office.